Okay, so as we move forward in the book of Mark, I will probably pretty consistently refer you back to the very beginning of it, because I think that that's the thesis statement of the book of Mark, is that this is the good news of Jesus the Christ. He's the Messiah, and He's the Son of God. What Mark does is he says, this is what I believe, this is the good news, but then he just allows Jesus' life to prove that. And so as you go through the book of Mark, rarely is Jesus openly referred to as the Son of God. It's typically, well, he went here, he did this thing, and the things that he does and the things that he says are so different than what people are used to that by the time you're done with Mark, you are left with the conclusion that Mark is right. Mark is correct. Jesus is the Christ. He is the Son of God. He isn't just some good teacher. He's not a typical king figure by any measurement. And so in the first chapter and in the first half of the second chapter, you are introduced to Jesus at his baptism. You're introduced to his preaching and the fact that even the miracles he's performing, the demons are being cast out. He teaches with authority, and then he's picking his disciples are not. I guess you might put it this way, like if somebody becomes president, they begin to acquire a cabinet, right? They're going to surround themselves with certain people that are going to help them be defense secretary and then, secretary of state. And they're going to get that group of people that they surround themselves with to help them do the job. So here's Jesus. If he's going to be king, what sort of people is he surrounding himself with? Well, he's got a couple of fishermen. He's got a tax collector. It's an odd thing what you're seeing in the account of Mark, is that Jesus is not like what people would expect. And then down in verse 18, we begin to start seeing some of this controversy. John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and they came and said to him, "Why did John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast? But your disciples do not fast." So here, why are your disciples not acting religious enough? Might be the way we would put it. Because as much as fasting is not a common practice for us, it was a very common practice for the Jews of that time period. And especially the Pharisees were known for fasting quite regularly. If you remember the account of the Pharisee and the tax collector, and the way even he prays, he mentions that. And so why aren't your disciples? And Jesus' answer to that is, well, this is a new cloth. We're starting a new thing. And because of the newness of it, we're not fasting like we're mourning. There's good things that are coming. So that's kind of the introduction to them starting to say, look, we're not sure that you're the kind of guy that we're used to. But fasting, I mean, there is no hard and fast rule about fasting. Okay? You can fast as often or as rarely as you'd like. So in verse 18 through 22, when they're arguing with him and saying, well, wait a second, our disciples and John the Baptist's disciples, they fast, your disciples don't. Why is that? And Jesus gives his answer to it. But at the end of the day, whether you fast or not is not the old law doesn't stand on that. But in verse 23, we're going to talk about the Sabbath. And how much of the old law, how important is the Sabbath to the old law? It's extremely, right? It's a huge deal. So fasting, well, that's kind of odd. Your disciples don't fast. But now, in verse 23, it happened that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now, this will become a major point of contention in the days ahead. And you'll see it throughout chapter 3 as well. You get into chapter 3, he's going to heal on the Sabbath. This issue that they have, that Jesus is doing work on the Sabbath. And one of the things that we want to understand is that Jesus is proving something by doing his kind of work on the Sabbath. Now, he is working on the Sabbath. What kind of work is he doing? What? Healing. Yeah, he's healing people. He's performing miracles. He's doing his Father's work, right? And Jesus will even bring up in other gospel accounts that there is a group of people that do work every single Sabbath. Who? It's the priests. Yeah, the priests do work every Sabbath, and they're allowed to do it, right? Because it's the work of God. So one aspect of what Jesus is doing as he heals on the Sabbath, because you think about it, Jesus is specifically healing on the Sabbath on occasions, right? He's not stopping. That would remove the controversy, wouldn't it? Like he could do that. He could just say, well, it's Sabbath, and that seems to upset some people. So I'll just wait till Sunday, or I'll wait till Tuesday. He could have done that, but he doesn't. He just takes it head on. So one of the reasons that he does that is for them to understand that he is doing his Father's work, and he's doing the work of a priest. Because who is Jesus to us? Yeah, he's our high priest. He's king and priest, right? So that's one aspect to it. So then you go down here and they say, it's not, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was in need and his companions became hungry, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests, and also gave it to those who are with him. So the first thing that Jesus is going to do is give an answer from the Old Testament. So they say, look, you are working on the Sabbath, and they're calling him out on an Old Testament law. So what does Jesus do? Yeah, he quotes Scripture. It's not like he's a dummy, right? That's the first thing. It's not like, oh, I just didn't realize, or he doesn't. No. So, but he goes and he quotes from an account in 1 Samuel chapter 21 and references Leviticus 24. In 1 Samuel chapter 21, David, while fleeing from Saul, runs into Abiathar the priest and asks for some food. And Abiathar says, look, all we've got here is the showbread. We've taken every 7 days, according to the Levitical law, they would replace the showbread that had been on the table of the showbread in the temple. And the priests were allowed to eat the 7-day-old bread. They could have that, and they put new bread on the table. But only the priests were allowed to eat it. And the Scripture was very, very clear on that. It's only for the priests. And so Abiathar says, well, all we have is this. And he gives it to him, and David and his men eat. Now, David is not a Levite. He's not a priest by any stretch of the imagination. And Jesus makes it clear in verse 26, was it lawful for David to do that? Look at verse 26. No. Yeah. So it is literally, which is not lawful. not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest, and he also gave it to those who were with him. So, here's this case. So, Jesus is walking through a field. Is Jesus eating the showbread? Is that what Jesus did? No, he's picking grains, right? They're just walking through a field, right? And they're just getting little grains and eating those as they walk through a wheat field. David, on the other hand, he does something that is clearly against the Old Testament law. Now, there are one of two answers as to what Jesus is trying to say here. One is, look, David did this thing that was illegal, clearly wrong. But y'all like David, and so you'll let him get away with that. But you don't like me, so if I'm walking through a field, you're going to call me out on this thing that isn't wrong, right? Is Jesus walking through a field and getting grain as they walk through the field? Is that clearly work? It's not clearly work, right? It's not clearly work. What David did was clearly wrong. So one answer is, you are hypocrites. You, like David, so you won't say anything when David does that, but you'll say something when I do that because you don't like me. That's one option. The other option is, it's illegal, except why does David get the showbread? Why does the priest give the showbread to David? Mercy. Yeah, I heard old man say they're hungry. And not just like, oh, I'd like a snack. Like fleeing for our lives hungry, right? And so there is a mercy element to this. That Abiathar understood, yes, this bread is only meant for the priest to eat, but there are men who are dying here. Maybe we should show some mercy. Now, does Jesus ever say anything else that says it's okay to show mercy on the Sabbath? Jesus talks about there's another thing that you do and nobody has any problem with on the Sabbath. Yeah, you're going to pull your animal out of a ditch. Right? If your animal's in a ditch and you pull it out of the ditch, nobody calls that work. They call that mercy. And that's an animal. It's an animal. So either Jesus is saying, y'all are hypocrites because you let David get away with stuff because you like David and you don't like me. Or he's saying, we understand it's okay to show mercy and that trumps some other things. Or the third option is he might be saying both. Right? He might be saying, look, when David has shown some mercy, you all are okay with it. But here it is. Jesus, by the way, as he's walking on the Sabbath, as he's walking from one place to another on the Sabbath, where's he likely going? Like, what's Jesus doing every single Sabbath during his 3 years of preaching? Yeah, he's going to synagogues and the temple, and he's preaching and he's teaching and he's doing God's work. So here's a guy, and he's going from one place to another, and he walks through a field and he gets a little bit of food, and you go, oh, look at that guy working on the Sabbath. Do you see the problem? Now, that's the first part of it, is this David example. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts on the David example? Because that one it can be a little bit confusing as to what Jesus is saying there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Man, what a beautiful connection. I hadn't even thought about that. You're right. You've got a David King connection to a Jesus King connection. Yeah, absolutely. So, which moves really nicely into the very next thing that he says about it, doesn't it? Right? Yeah, absolutely. Any other comments or questions? Yeah. When it's needed for mercy's sake? Yeah, I think so. I think in the same way that, yeah, yeah. I mean, if a house is on fire on the Sabbath, you still put the fire out. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Mhm. It, yeah, yeah, yeah. So there are clear exceptions, and just practically speaking, like you said, yeah, children are born on the Sabbath. The midwives are going to be involved in that, and I mean, the moms are. It's called labor for a reason, right? So, yeah. Um, okay. So the next thing that he says is down in verse 27. The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So now there's a couple of things here. One, how does Jesus refer to himself? What title does he give himself in this? Son of Man, right? That's what you're going to see in Mark. Jesus will refer to himself as Son of Man. He's going to emphasize his connection to humanity. But the things that he does emphasizes his connection to what Mark started out by saying, which is he's the Son of God. So Jesus is saying, I'm the Son of Man, which is true, right? But the way he lives shows a clear connection to deity. And so here, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Now, that is just a truth, right? Who came first, man or the Sabbath? Right? God made human beings, and there was a big chunk of time where there was no Sabbath, but then eventually you get to the law of Moses, and God makes a Sabbath. Who's he make the Sabbath for? It's for man, right? So the whole point of it is that Sabbath rest was for people. Now, who is Jesus working for on the Sabbath? He's doing God's work for people. You see my point there? He's going and teaching and preaching and sharing the word with people. He's going to the synagogues. He's going to the temple. And this idea that what he's doing is work, even if it is work, it's work to fulfill what God meant the Sabbath to be in the first place. So what he's doing is he's saying, I understand the Sabbath, you don't. You understand a rule. I understand the concept behind that rule. And that never happens in religion, does it? Where we understand a behavior, but we don't understand why we do that behavior. And that's the danger, isn't it? That's how you get a generation that arises that doesn't know God, is because they know the behaviors, but they don't know why the behaviors. And then the next thing that he says is, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, here is this statement that he makes that really stands out, right? Because now what he's saying is, I have an authority. So we've heard him teach with authority, but now he has authority over the Sabbath too. And so you're left with that, and then at the end of Mark 2, you just move to chapter 3, right? And he's off to the next thing. All he does is he says, Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And then he went off to the synagogue. See, it forces you to think about it. What does that mean? What does it mean that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath? Mm-hmm. 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 Yep. Yeah. Well, and I think you're right, but I do think, well, it's like you said, does it mention his humanity? Does it? Yeah, it does. But you're right. And it gets back to what's Mark doing here. So the Son of Man is even Lord of the Sabbath. Does that mean, when Jesus says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, does that mean that any human being can just do whatever they want on the Sabbath? No, that's not what he's saying. Jesus is making a reference there. And I think you're right. If you start digging, you get back to Daniel 7. Well, why is he Lord of Sabbath? Because the dominion's been given to him. Yeah. So absolutely, absolutely. And so Jesus is making the statement that he has dominion over the Sabbath. What is the Sabbath, by the way? It's a day of rest. He's the one who has authority over rest. You want to talk about where rest comes from and the value of rest, and what Hebrews will talk about, the ultimate rest that we look forward to. He's the King. And so in Mark chapter 2, he's addressing that idea of, let's talk about what the Sabbath really is. When God had the Jews rest on the Sabbath day, he always was pointing towards the idea that there would be a greater rest coming. Mark chapter 3. So then from there he enters into the synagogue, and there's a man who has a withered hand, and again it's on the Sabbath, and they were watching him to see if he would heal on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Get up and come forward." And he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill?" So now we're back to that Sabbath. Here's the thing. How long had the Jews been keeping the Sabbath by the time Jesus comes around? Very close to forever. Yeah, it's about 1,600 years. I mean, this is a very long time, okay? But as you look at Jesus in the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, who understands the Sabbath better? These Jews who've been doing it for 1,600 years, or him? He gets it, right? And so he says, look, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? That's it. You don't even have to answer it. You know the answer. It's a rhetorical question, right? But they kept silent, and after looking around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So now what Jesus is doing on the Sabbath is now you have this Lord of the Sabbath, and he heals a man on the Sabbath, and the healing, that points towards his dominion, doesn't it? It's hard to argue. If he can heal on the Sabbath, who's with him? God's with him, right? So God's with him on the Sabbath. He can heal. But the other thing that it mentions there is Jesus is very upset. He's grieved because they have hard hearts. Because he just asked a question. Should you kill or save a life on the Sabbath? And what did they answer? Nothing. They said nothing. Because everybody knows the right answer, but the right answer doesn't let them accuse him. It is more important to them to be right than to do the right thing. Right? The honesty, the humility is not there. And so Jesus is grieved over their hardness of heart. And it also says he is angry over it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great point because, yeah, with the story of the Good Samaritan, you have the Levite and the priest. They walk by on the other side. One very logical reason they would give this is, well, I can't touch that. That'd make me unclean. I'm on my way to Jerusalem. So, yeah, and it is completely forgetting the nature of what God had always intended His people to be. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The hardness of heart that you see, it blinds you to evidence, right? You won't pay attention to what is right in front of your face, and so here Jesus is performing these miracles, and he asks I mean, it's a good question. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? That's the kind of question the master teacher asks, right? Because there's only one right answer. He's already figured it out, but they are more interested in accusing him than in learning. And so he has a man stretch out his hand, and the hand was restored. And then in verse 6, the Pharisees went out and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him. Now here's verse 6 is a good example of how hardened their hearts had become. The Pharisees are one group. The Herodians are another. The Herodians are attached and associated with the Herods, right? They are very pro-Roman, and essentially we're going to run things in a way that the Romans want us to. How did the Pharisees feel about the Romans? Yeah, they hated them in every way, right? So, the Pharisees now have decided to get together and conspire with the Herodians against him. What that tells you is they've found something they hate more than each other. That's what that comes down to. They have found something they hate more than each other. Is my friend. Yep. And all of this ties together with that hardness of heart, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you're right. These are teaching spaces, right, where this is happening. He's in a synagogue. There's a lot of people watching, and teacher incurs a stricter judgment, right? These Pharisees and whatnot are expected to give a better answer than that. Yeah, yeah, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, yeah. In Paul's after the riots in Acts 20 or so, yeah, they did the same thing against Paul. The Pharisees and Sadducees came together to get rid of him, and so yeah, you see this, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that the hatred for Christ and his disciples is enough to bring these groups that normally would not at all come together, bring them together in not good ways, I guess. It's another way to bring unity, I guess. Okay, so they begin to conspire as to how they might destroy him. But then verse 7, Jesus withdrew to the sea with his disciples, and a great multitude from Galilee followed, and from Judea, and from Jerusalem, and from Idumea, and beyond the Jordan, in the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon. And a great number of people heard of all that he was doing, and came to him. And he told his disciples that a boat should stand ready for him, because the crowds, they would not crowd him, for he had healed many, with the result that all those who had afflicted pressed around him in order to touch him. And whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they would fall down before him and shout, "You are the Son of God." And he earnestly warned them not to tell who he was. Now, if you look at this account in one of the other Gospels, you're going to get some really great sermons. Not with Mark. He just said, oh, by the way, Jesus is out, and he's out by the Sea of Galilee, and who's coming to him? Everybody. Everybody from everywhere, right? And they're crowding around him. And he's healing them. And this is all being done publicly, right? This is not something that's being hidden at all. And then down in verse 11, the unclean spirits, when they fall down before him, what are they shouting? "You are the Son of God." And he earnestly warned them not to tell who he was. That's another interesting thing about Jesus, right? He casts out the demons. The demons say that he's the Son of God, and what's he saying? Yeah, he's quieting fame. If you have, one of the things that is hard to understand for us, because we already have a picture in our mind of the kind of king Jesus is, right? So you know the end of the story. I need you to imagine for a second that you didn't know Jesus as the suffering servant. You didn't know him as the one who would die for you. You just knew the Christ is coming, and he's going to have dominion and authority and power. You are expecting a king who's going to be like all the other kings that you've ever seen, except more. Well, all the other kings that you've ever seen, when it comes time for them to be praised, they exalt themselves, and they want other people to exalt them. What's Jesus doing? Doing the exact opposite. Right? He's keeping it quiet. The reality is that Jesus' greatness is so great that even when he tries to keep it quiet, it spreads. That's how powerful his kingship is. So then starting verse 13, he will call together his apostles, and he appoints those 12 so that they would be with him, so that he could send them out to preach and have authority to cast out the demons. So he's going to give them authority too, which, by the way, when you have somebody who is now taking other people and giving them power, what does that tell you about them? Right? If I can give you the power to cast out demons, what does that tell you about my power? It's greater, right? Yeah, Jesus is greater, right? But he's now appointing 12. He has apostles. That's what kings do, by the way. Kings have ambassadors. They have emissaries. They have people who they send out to preach the news of them. And that's what Jesus will do. He's going to send them out in pairs, and he's going to send them into the various cities. And in the various cities, he'll send them there, and if the city does not accept it, what are they supposed to do? Shake the dust off your feet, right, and move on to the next one. If they do, Jesus says, I'll follow after. You don't think about it too often, but that's kingly. That's kingship. I'll send my emissaries. We'll figure out what cities are for us, and which ones are against us, and the ones that are for us, I'll follow after you. And so he appoints his 12, and we're given the names of them. Simon, whom he gave the name Peter, and James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. And Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus and Simon the Zealot. And who else is mentioned? And it specifically says who betrayed him. Right? And one of the things that you're going to find out as you go through, because what Mark is doing is he's getting you to scratch your head. Here Jesus picks 12, but wait a second. Are they all a good pick? No, they're not all a good pick. And Mark calls that out right in the beginning, right? Judas is one of the 12, but he's going to betray him. Well, why would that be? But as you progress through and you look at Mark's account, what you start out by saying, well, why would he appoint somebody who would eventually betray him? What kind of king would do that? It seems to me like he's maybe not as good as he thought he was. But as you progress through Mark and the account, what do you end up finding? Why? Yeah, he's serving a purpose to hire himself. He's making sure that the crucifixion will happen. This is a part of the prophecy. This is a part of God's plan, right? So all of these things Mark is introducing you to the Jesus who knows the Sabbath better than the Jews know the Sabbath. The Jesus who appoints 12, and they're a motley crew, right? They're a motley crew, those sons of thunder and beyond, right? And, wait a second, he appoints this one who will betray him. Well, you keep reading and you realize why. Then verse 20, he came home and the crowd gathered again to such an extent that they could not even eat a meal. And when his own people heard of this, they went out to take custody of him, for they were saying he has lost his senses. The scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying he's possessed by Beelzebul, and he cast out the demons by the rulers of the demons. And he called them to himself and began speaking to them in parables. Now, several different things that I want you to catch in this particular section. One, as the crowds are coming in on Jesus, and we've seen this 2 times here in chapter 3 already, crowds come from everywhere, right? And such massive crowds that Jesus has to ask for a boat so he can be out on the water. Such massive crowds that he can't even stop and have a meal. Okay? How does Jesus handle that? Well, in each case, he continues to work on behalf of the people. At no point does he do what we would probably do, is just say, look, send the people away. I'm hungry. I don't have time for them. In fact, you don't see it in Mark's account, but when the crowds came in upon Jesus, eventually Jesus tells his apostles to leave, and he says, I'll take care of the crowds. I'll send them away. So Jesus is not acting the way a king normally would, which is you have people for that, right? He is himself caring about these crowds, so that he's going without so that they can have. But then the other thing that comes up is now, as all of this is happening, another controversy is leveraged against him. Well, the only reason he can perform these miracles is because, well, he's got power from Beelzebul. He's got power from Satan. It is a kingship. He does have authority, but it's dark authority, right? That's the idea. It's not authority from God. It's a dark authority. Well, Jesus' answer to that is that Jesus had come to plunder. And in order to do that, he had to bind the strong man. Now, in the context here, when it talks about Jesus binding the strong man, who's the strong man in this context? It's Satan. It's Satan. Satan's the strong man. What Jesus has been doing is casting out demons, and that's the specific miracle that he's being called out for right now, right? He performed other miracles too, like we saw the man with the withered hand. But right now, he's casting out demons, and probably this specific one is being addressed by his enemies, because when he casts out the demons, what are all the demons saying? He's the Son of God. So we got to address this thing. Here's how we address it. You know why those demons are doing that? Is because he's a bad guy. They're all on the same team. This is a conspiracy, right? That's the whole system that they're going with. And Jesus says, look, no, that doesn't work, because if I'm casting out the demons, if I'm with Satan, I'm dividing the house, right? We're undoing the work. Satan, demon possession is from Satan. We don't want to, if I'm on his team, I'm undoing his work. But instead he says, I'm binding the strong man so that I can plunder his house. So now, one thing is, so Satan is the one that he's binding, and on top of it, he wants to plunder his house. Well, what is it that Satan has that Jesus wants? Yeah, souls, right? People. Jesus says, what I'm doing is binding Satan so I can get what Satan currently has. I want people. I want the hearts of men. I want to save souls. The Son of Man came to seek and save that which is lost. And so the picture that he's giving is that. Now, in other accounts, it'll mention the fact that when Jesus' disciples came back after being able to cast out demons, Jesus says, I look and I see Satan falling from heaven like lightning. The binding of Satan that happened when the demons were cast out is why we don't have demon possession now. I don't know if you've noticed that. I haven't run into a demon-possessed person in a while. In a minute. The reason is because of this. Because what Jesus did and what Jesus gave authority to his disciples to do was to cast out those demons and bind that strong man so that his house could be plundered. Has that happened? Yeah. And so now we don't live in a world with that demon possession because of the work that was done at that time. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Yes. Well, we don't have demon possession in this era now because of what Jesus did. Yes, exactly. Yeah, great. Perfect, yeah. What? Interestingly, we don't see demon possession until the New Testament. So it seemed to be something that didn't exist before. It shows up right before Jesus, and then Jesus cast it out. So it was a small time period there. There were evil spirits in the Old Testament, but not the demon possession. Yeah. Okay. I'll get your question after class. We're at time here, but yeah.